Welcome to the Choral Connection, a series of interviews with musicians with whom Maestro Harold Rosenbaum has collaborated over his 47-year international conducting career. We hope you are inspired by their artistry and the stories they have to tell. For more about the series, please visit www.haroldrosenbaum.com.
Good morning, everybody. Today, I'm so happy to have Anthony Schuman, who is the son of the famous composer William Schuman. And Tony is a distinguished professor of architecture at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. So I'm sure he's very well known, but his father was a little bit more well known. So we're going to basically talk to Tony about his father today. Was not only a great composer, but as many of you know, he was the president of Juilliard and then the president of Lincoln Center. William Schuman was born in 1910 and played the violin and banjo as a child, but his overwhelming passion was baseball. As a late teen, he wrote popular songs with E.B. Marks Jr., a friend he had met long before at summer camp. Around that time, he met lyricist Frank Lesser and wrote some 40 songs with him. In 1930, he attended a Carnegie Hall concert of the New York Philharmonic conducted by Arturo Toscanini, and the very next day he decided to become a composer. From 1933 to 1938, he studied privately with Roy Harris. Harris brought Bill to the attention of the conductor Serge Koussevitzky, who championed many of his works and conducted his Symphony No. 2 in 1939. Mr. Schuman won the inaugural Pulitzer Prize for Music in 1943 for his cantata No. 2 called A Free Song, which is fabulous. I know the work. In 1945, he became president of the Juilliard School, founding the Juilliard String Quartet. While there, he left in 1961 to succeed John D. Rockefeller III as president of Lincoln Center, a position he held until 1969. He won a special Pulitzer Prize in 1985, citing more than half a century of contribution to American music as composer and educational leader, and he received the National Medal of Arts in 1987. Bill Schuman left a substantial body of work, among them 8 symphonies, his Concerto for Violin and Orchestra, New England Triptych, the American Festival Overture, 2 ballets, the Mail Order Madrigals, and 2 operas, one of them The Mighty Casey, which reflected his lifelong love of baseball, as I said, and an abundance of exceptionally good choral music, most of which I have conducted with him in the audience. So before I start asking you questions, Tony, let me tell the listeners about my relationship with your father. I first met him in 1980 when he came to Queens College, where I was teaching, along with Aaron Copland, when the Queens College Music Department became the Aaron Copland School of Music. I approached him, your father, to tell him that the piece that he wrote called The Carols of Death was one of the best choral works of the 20th century. And he said that I was in good company because Robert Shaw had told him the same thing. Now, at that time, I actually knew about 1/100th of the modern choral repertoire that I now know, but I still think these pieces are sublime. I told him when, in 1988, when I started my professional choir, the New York Virtuoso Singers, I told him I was thinking of having an ensemble of 12 people because of financial pressures. And he said, no, 16 would be a more appropriate number for a small choir. So be it. So I started a chorus of 16. Soon after that, he agreed to be on my board of advisors. And once in a while, I would call and ask his advice, and he was very free with his, with his advice and very nice about it. In later years, I was asked by the president of Juilliard, Joseph Polisi, to create and conduct a full concert of Bill's music at the school. I don't remember what the occasion was. Maybe you can help in a moment. But a big chunk of that concert was selections from his opera Casey at the Bat. Then, for his 80th birthday celebration, I produced and conducted a concert on which an entirely different choral repertoire of his was performed. There, he wrote a lot of brilliant choral music. I believe you and your sister and your mom were at that concert, and your father had attended the dress rehearsal because he had some conflict when the actual performance took place, I think. And finally, I was asked by Juilliard to conduct his Carols of Death at the 10th anniversary of his passing on a memorial program, which also had Leonard Slatkin conducting the Juilliard Orchestra. So did I get most of that right?
I think you did, and for anything else, your listeners can refer to the biographies by Joseph Polisi or Stephen Swain. The one thing I would add is when you make reference to his 8 symphonies, as Dad always said, I composed 8 symphonies, numbers 3 through 10.
Yeah,
because,
I read about that.
because the first 2 were withdrawn.
Right. Well, he wouldn't be the first composer who withdrew a lot of his works.
But yes, you did get that right, and I appreciate the emphasis on the choral music, because Dad is primarily referred to often as a symphonist and the brashness of the music, and that's not inaccurate, but what it leaves out is some of the more contemplative, philosophical, deeply emotional work that he wrote for chorus, and he spent a lot of time selecting texts. He read poetry. I mean, as you know, he set McLeish, he set Whitman, and then here and there, McClatchy was commissioned, for example, to do poetry for the Liberty cantata. So that was Wilbur, but he worked with Jan McClatchy as well, and it's an important part of the work. And of course, he admired you as a choral conductor, and of course, he was pleased that you liked his music.
I love
I would say probably that your chorus and perhaps one would mention the Greg Smith singers, or maybe a little earlier, that championed his work, and performed it well. So he didn't. Dad was not a glad hander. He wouldn't say to someone, "I really like that," if he hadn't. I remember one time, and this is an example of his humor. He attended a concert by high school students in New York City, probably playing Chester, a piece from Triptych. And at the end of their performance, he said to them, "You know, I've heard this piece played by some of the major orchestras of the world, the Boston Symphony, the New York Philharmonic, and I want you to know they all played it better than you did, but none played it with more heart."
Right. Very good. Very good. I knew you were going to say that. I had a suspicion you were going to say that. Before I forget, I want to show you something. You don't know this, but he signed this for me.
That's very nice.
Very nice. I have it framed.
Yeah.
It's interesting signature. He has like 2 strokes. Is that his typical signature?
Dad didn't have a great handwriting. You know, he had, among other things, he had a muscular condition.
Oh.
He had a mild version of ALS, of Lou Gehrig disease, and he had not much strength in his upper arm muscles, and his handwriting was fairly shaky. So that's part of where that came from.
But and yet he obviously hand wrote his music because the Sibelius and Finale weren't invented.
And he required a good copyist.
Right.
For years that was Tony Strilko and then others. But
and the copy, when you said good copyist, the copyist obviously worked hand in hand.
Had to be able to read his manuscript.
I believe it or not, I found a piece by Samuel Barber about 15 years ago, which had never been published. And subsequently, I had it published with Schirmer's, but there was one note in there, because I read it, I had the manuscript, or a copy of the manuscript. There was one note that was obviously wrong, but it looked like the note that he put in there. But Schirmer's, I told Schirmer's it couldn't be a C sharp, it has to be a D sharp. But Schirmer's, what they did was they took the liberty of calling Giancarlo Menotti, Barber's companion, who confirmed that it was a mistake. But anyway, that's just a funny story. Um, well, let me start by asking you to simply tell us things about your father that are not in textbooks, like what you just said. What kind of man was he when he was not working?
Well, of course, Dad worked a good bit of the time, and I'm thinking particularly of the Juilliard years, since those were the years when I was home and in high school. When he went to Lincoln Center was when I went off to college, so it was a different relationship. But during those years, I'm talking about the 50s primarily here. We lived in a house in New Rochelle. And when Dad wasn't at Juilliard, and of course, he would say every morning, "Well, I'm going off to school now." And of course, I was going off to school also. I was going to elementary school. He was going to Juilliard. So it took some explaining what his job actually was. And we could talk a little bit more about Juilliard because those were wonderful years for him. Wonderful years for him because he was surrounded by a wonderful group of colleagues, some of whom he inherited and many of whom he brought in. Mentioning particularly Mark Schubart, who had been a music critic that Dad brought in as dean at Juilliard and was maybe his closest friend in the music world. Mark wasn't a musician per se. I don't know if you knew Mark. Dad later brought him to Lincoln Center, where he started the Lincoln Center Institute, which was the program to bring Lincoln Center artists into high schools around the city.
Wow.
So there was that. Saturdays he generally wrote, and Sundays was more the family day. I mean, that wasn't a hard rule. Dad had an office. I'm sitting in an office now. You can see windows behind me. There's windows in this study on three sides. It's very, very similar. Some would say eerily similar to the studio that my father had on the second floor of the house in New Rochelle. It was entered through the bedroom. In other words, it was kind of, it wasn't like a very public room. And it was understood that when Dad was in there with the door shut, you didn't disturb him, and he was writing music. But he was, of course, writing music all the time. If he was working on a piece, it was in his head all the time. And, there would be times when Dad would be silent and everybody understood this could be at the dinner table, it could be in the car. He was writing music in his head,
Hmm.
right? Because of course in his head, he would hear, like Beethoven, I guess, what he was doing. Sundays though was the family day, and the kinds of things I remember specifically, that we would take walks around the block. We would go to what I call Larchmont Park, a wonderful park, Manor. I think it's called Manor Park in Larchmont, New York. We'd go maybe 2 or 3 times a summer to the Polo Grounds to see our beloved New York Giants. You mentioned that Dad was a ball player. He was an avid ball player when he was at camp, and retained a love of baseball throughout his life, although in his later years, he didn't watch it quite as much. But I loved going to the Polo Grounds. We saw Willie Mays play there together.
Did you see Willie Mays when he turned around and caught the ball?
I saw that on television. I'd like to lie, or the Bobby Thompson home run. I wasn't there for either of those. But that was so when Dad wrote Casey, with what I consider a brilliant libretto by Jeremy Gury. When he wrote Casey, it was such a labor of love. And of course, it's one of my favorite works of my father because it was one of our strongest bonds.
Right.
I'm not a musician. I like music. I write avocationally satirical lyrics, but I connected with Dad particularly around Casey, and then there are others of the works that I liked very much. I liked most of the choral music very much. I like the Third Symphony enormously, but I'm not an expert on that. I don't necessarily grasp the nuances in all of the music.
Well, 99% of people who listen to music in general don't know anything technically about it.
So the other things we would do on Sunday evening, often we would go out, have dinner out, and that would be often with family friends. But I remember particularly there was a restaurant we would go to in Larchmont called Cook's. It's gone now, but Cook's had 3 things. It had fabulous hot dogs. It had skee ball, a little game room, and it had chocolate chip mint ice cream. Dad liked his ice cream too, and he liked hot dogs. My family was German on both sides, kind of all the way back. My mother carried that culture forward a bit more than my father, who was very thoroughly assimilated, but he did like hot dogs and sauerkraut. And I remember often when we would go to performances of his at the Philharmonic, we would go out for a late night nosh, and there used to be a restaurant, I think it was called Blue Ribbon. It was a German, there used to be a bunch of German restaurants in New York. Remember Luchau's?
Yeah, of course.
And we would go to the Blue Ribbon and we would have, knockwurst and sauerkraut and potato salad. And that was probably about as German as Dad got, because of course the family is Jewish, and there was a distant cousin in France who was lost during the war. So there was a complicated relationship there, but there were cultural aspects that came forward.
Right. So when he was silent and you suspected he was composing, was that was that difficult for the children, for you and your sister, or did you fully understand, not to bother?
No, I think we understood that. I think we understood that. I mean, he was present at the dinner table. We had dinner together pretty much every night, as I remember, except for nights when there'd be a concert at Juilliard. But Dad was a very present father. I would say probably not as involved in our upbringing as my mother, because she was with us basically full time.
Right. And so some of these people, can you name some of the people who he would bring to the house, or very famous people that you knew, because they
Well, that's an interesting question. I had a very helpful discussion with my sister about that, because the people that he was closest to, that came to the house more often, I had mentioned Mark Schubart. Another one would be Norman Lloyd, and his wife Ruth Lloyd. Norman was a composer. He did the arrangements for the Fireside book of folk songs, and Norman and Ruth together could sight read brilliantly. And at the family parties, they would sit at the piano. There was a Steinway in the living room. They would sit at the piano and go through the Gershwin and the Rodgers and Hart songbooks, occasionally a little Kern, but particularly Gershwin and Rodgers and Hart, and everybody sang. So I know the lyrics to all of those songs, and it was I just love that.
Yeah.
And Norman was a good friend and a raconteur. Mark Schubart was probably the person who he was closest to, who came to the house most often, and Mark was also a great friend of our mother. Norman Singer, who ran City Center and then was the director of the Chamber Music Society. Norman was a very good friend. So then in the world of composers, the people that he, I think, was probably closest to would be Lenny, and Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, and Morton Gould.
Oh.
And of the three, of course, Morton was the wit.
I was just going to say, yeah.
Not that the others were without a sense of humor. And I remember particularly at Dad's, I think it was Dad's 75th birthday, there was a little party at the house in Connecticut, and Aaron was there, and Lenny was there, and Morton was there, and someone had the idea, said, let's go around the room and everybody describe Bill Schuman in one word. Okay. And it came around to Morton, and Morton said, promising.
Oh. Yeah.
And that was kind of typical. Lenny was someone that Dad didn't see necessarily always and often, but there was, I think, a great love between the two of them, and that started right away in 1939. Koussevitzky performed Dad's Second Symphony, which was not well received, but the person that met him at the train was Lenny Bernstein, who was then obviously a prodigy as an undergraduate at Harvard. And I was just sort of trying to track down to get that date right, and looked it up in the Bernstein letters. And there's a letter there in which he refers to Dad as Billy Schuman, and everyone called Dad Bill. Yeah. People who didn't know maybe called him William, but Lenny's probably the only one who called him Billy.
That's funny. In common with Lenny was their love of pop music, or so did your father keep up his love for popular music? Did he play popular music at all?
Dad didn't play the piano. Dad said, I can play every instrument badly, he used to say. And he and when he composed for a particular instrument, and of course this was an advantage of being at Juilliard, where you had access to brilliant musicians, he would ask a harpist or a clarinetist or a trumpetist, he'd say, can you play, give them the score, said, can you play that? And they would come back a week later and they would say, I can play that, it's terribly difficult. And Dad said, great.
Yeah, I was, right.
So,
Yeah, that's good. I remember speaking to Thea Musgrave,
mhm.
who liked to do the same thing. She would make sure that things were playable. Um, and Sam Adler, who wrote, is a composer, and he wrote this book on orchestration. And he also made sure that what he was writing and composing was, was playable. So it's really important. And John Curigliano once came to one of my rehearsals because he was thinking of writing a sung symphony, and he wanted to hear every like human sound that one can make besides singing. So so composers do research. They don't just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So you asked about the love of popular music. Of course, Dad admired Lenny, especially as a composer for musical theater.
right.
And some of you may have seen even the revival of West Side Story, and the music remains, although the setting has changed.
Yeah.
Um, Dad liked the popular music, particularly of his youth. He used to say popular music is courting music. That's his generation.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what made that all work was that I also liked the music of his youth, because it included Gershwin and Rodgers and Hart, but it was also Roger Wolf Kahn, and it was all kinds of music that we both liked, and we used to listen to that together. And he didn't particularly like the popular music of my youth. He didn't. I thought Buddy Holly was pretty terrific, and Dad didn't really get that. He did like the Beatles a bit because he found them musically a bit more interesting.
Oh yeah.
But
Oh,
as a whole, no. Um, but we used to sing. We would sing sometimes, my father and I, at the dinner table, and we would sing when we were traveling, and we would sing what's now called the American Songbook. We didn't call it that at the time, and it was. I think I felt years later that we were really singing to each other.
hmm I love that music. I mean, talking about Irving Berlin and
Yeah,
great great melodies and lyrics. It was so special. And I feel sorry for young people today who don't know that music or don't know the great musicals, Oklahoma and West Side Story, and yeah, sometimes uh, so, somebody told me a story. Okay, who was it? Betty Allen, who I believe was started the Harlem Boys Choir.
hmm
She told me a story once, or the Harlem School of the Arts, I think it was, that one young kid came to audition to be in the Harlem Boys Choir, and he rapped. He didn't know that rapping didn't have melody. That was his audition. Anyway, yeah, that was great music back then. And yes, I love the Beatles very, very much myself. But I love the older stuff too, very much. Um, did you before he came to Juilliard, he taught composition for 3 years at the Sarah Lawrence School. Did you ever see him teaching and guiding young composers?
No, although, as I like to say, I attended Sarah Lawrence College before it was co-ed, because Sarah Lawrence had a nursery school, uh, and so I was worked over by undergraduate psych majors. But I loved my years at the nursery school, but I didn't see Dad teaching because I was like 4
Yeah, right.
at the time. That was a very important part of Dad's life. He loved the teaching at Sarah Lawrence, and he used to refer to the Sarah Lawrence College as my football team.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Choir? No,
Or the Sarah Lawrence chorus. He founded the chorus at Sarah Lawrence.
I didn't know that because I
Oh
know
yeah,
Harold Axe conducted the chorus around that. Maybe that was after.
I
Well,
think that was later.
obviously it was later.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah. No, that would have been in the early '40s.
Wow.
Um,
But he taught composition there too, right? I mean,
I it's possible. I don't remember. If you say so, I'll take your word for it. But I remember we understood primarily that he did teach the music theory courses there. He taught whatever the music curriculum was. I think he was probably the only musician on faculty at the time.
yeah, sometimes some schools have a very small department, so probably there were no composition majors. But I read somewhere that he taught composition. Maybe, as you said, it was theory. Maybe threw in some mentoring for young composers. Who knows?
And then, later, some years later, at Sarah Lawrence, um, I think they named the music library after Dad, and there was a very nice dedication, and they had a concert of his music there. And Dad was a sentimental person, as am I. And it was very meaningful for him to have that recognition and connection to Sarah Lawrence. And on that same topic, Dad spent wonderful years at Juilliard. Jean Morel, who was conducting the Juilliard Orchestra, it was a wonderful group of people there. Many of them assembled by Dad, and others who, as I said, who were there. And then after Dad left Juilliard, there was a series of presidencies at Juilliard after him, where people needed to establish their own direction and their own stamp on the school. And Dad was not particularly brought back into the fold during those years. And when Joseph Polisi became president of Juilliard, and now that's what, 36 years ago. I mean, I could see it like yesterday. Um, Dad was very enthusiastic about Joseph. Joseph looked to Dad as a mentor. They had a wonderful friendship. And Joseph made Dad welcome in Juilliard in a way that was quite wonderful. As you know, that's where the memorial service was held, and a lot of that was through the friendship and support from Joseph.
And Joseph wrote a book on your father. In fact, I have it right here on the shelf. It's one of, well, I had it here.
Well, I have it if you want me to hold it up.
Okay.
But no, Joseph wrote the first serious. It's part biography and part music analysis. And then Stephen Swain, who's a musicologist at Dartmouth, wrote another very serious academic study of Dad. And the two books together are a wonderful summary of his life. There had been an earlier book by Vincent Persichetti and Flora Retta Schreiber, much earlier. And Vincent was a good friend. I don't want to leave that out.
Nice.
You know the story where Vincent interviewed for a teaching job. I think he was at Curtis, and he came up to New York to interview for a teaching job at Juilliard. And on the way back, he had another thought, and he telegraphed to Dad. It said, "Forgot to mention, have PhD." And Dad wrote back, cabled back, "Not to worry, won't hold against you."
That's funny. Well, your father obviously will be remembered for many things, but there's one other thing I want to point out or bring up. I noticed that there is a William Schuman Prize, which is given to the most outstanding score of those submitted to the annual BMI Student Composer Award Competition.
That's right.
Father's name lives on in yet one more way.
And that's still given every year, and we receive a nice notice about who received that prize. And occasionally we hear from that young composer, but yes.
Yeah, and I've been to a number of those ceremonies. One time they put the prize-winning compositions in a showcase in the back of the room, and I looked at one of them, and it was I think that was the first prize winner was a piece for chorus, 4 choruses, each one having 4 singers and a trombone. It's a South American composer, but these are very important events and very important competitions. ASCAP has it also, as you know. Yeah, it's important to nurture young talent. And as head of Juilliard, he oversaw a lot of great activity and a lot of initiatives. That's so wonderful. Is there anything else you want to say about your father that hasn't been said? I mean, we can go on forever, but and I should say that when I called you the other day, I said, "My God, we've spoken before, but you'd sound just like him. You have his timbre and range and accent and everything." But that's not so uncommon. Anyway, is there anything else you want to say that we haven't covered?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Dad always felt, the institutional work was important to him, but fundamentally he was a composer. But he also needed that other aspect of his work, and some of that had to do. And I would say this: I think Dad was an indefatigable supporter of American music, and nothing irritated him more than to see concert programs year after year so thoroughly dominated by primarily European. That's loosened up a bit more.
Oh yeah.
in recent years. But he was supportive of new music organizations, and particularly admired conductors who played American music. I mean, Bernstein was one, clearly. Leonard Slatkin is another, who, among others, played his, but not only his, but other American composers. And that was a strong cause. Dad was Dad's expression of his political and social convictions was primarily through his music. He was not an activist. I think he was cautioned by Copeland's experience before the HUAC committee in the early 50s, and Aaron was more outspoken than my father. My father was progressive, but not active in that way. I think if you look at who he set and what those words are, if you're interested in Dad's values, to the extent that you can't read them in musical notes alone, which is a whole subject of a doctoral thesis for someone else, right? But I think if you look at who he set and what those words are, you have a sense of the emotional and values held by my father.
Right, like the piece he won the Pulitzer for, right? Was it the Canticle of Freedom? I mentioned it before. And he won actually two Pulitzers, didn't he? Or a lifetime award.
Well, two poems. I'm thinking for some reason I'm going back to Sarah Lawrence. I think the first piece he set was a poem by Genevieve Taggart called Holiday Song. When was it ever a waste of time to climb hills? Now, Dad was not an outdoorsman, not since the days at camp, but it's a lovely poem. Are you familiar with it? Holiday Song?
No, I don't think I am. No.
It's something to look up.
Yeah.
Early, very, very early setting. But you know, he set a lot of Whitman. He set McLeish.
I mean, the Carols of Death, I believe, are all Whitman.
Yeah.
And to me, as I said before, those are some of the most remarkable choral pieces I've ever.
And of course, he also set the Sears Roebuck catalog.
Oh, I know. I conducted that.
And Franklin, you know, for Rounds on Famous Words. So there's a lot of American. Dad was an American. He was an American patriot with a small p and a Democrat with a small d, and he held those values very close, very close.
And he was a very nice man too. That's for sure. And it always amazes me when you hear about composers like Charles Ives, you know, who had a full-time insurance executive position, and only after hours, and you know, Mahler, who conducted so much and composed in the summer, and your father, who was such an important man, and yet he found time to compose a lot of music. It's just amazing to me how brilliant
he was. Very disciplined. I'm sure you know he kept a book where he wrote down the number of hours each year that he composed, and he would set himself a target and he would meet it.
Wow.
Oh no, he absolutely. Dad didn't waste time.
Right.
He didn't fiddle around. He didn't watch television much, although we all liked Sid Caesar.
Oh yeah.
But he was no, he made very good use of his time.
And did he take the train into Manhattan and work on the
train? He drove to Juilliard.
He drove to Juilliard.
Drove to Juilliard. It was about a half-hour drive. And of course, as you can imagine, this is only possible because of the support from my mother, Frances Schuman, Frankie Schuman, who was a force in her own right, particularly in the world of nonprofits, the Friends of Public Broadcasting and McDowell Colony, American Composers Orchestra. She was active with all of those. Wow. And she was also the Cub Scout den leader.
Okay, wonderful. Now, one more thing, the Juilliard campus, was that at Lincoln Center at the time? Or
No. So the Juilliard was on Claremont.
Right.
It's the old building that cut the commute a bit. When Lincoln Center was in the planning stages, the discussion from I don't know if it's from the Star or not, but said, well, we should have a first class School of the Arts here. And Dad at Juilliard convinced the board that school should be Juilliard. So he was very instrumental in the decision which was not an easy decision and not popular everywhere, the decision to move Juilliard from Claremont to Lincoln Center. And then, of course, the other things that he did at Juilliard, in addition to founding the quartet that was with Bobby Mann, Robert Mann, was to start the dance division. And the early discussions about starting a drama division, although that was implemented under Menon, but those discussions started with consultants when Dad was there. And of course, when Juilliard moved to Lincoln Center, dance was already there. The drama department was there. And then the jazz component at Juilliard came a bit later.
Wow. You mentioned a few people. Before I go, I just want to tell you that I actually, Joe Polisi called me in 1994 and asked me to start a chorus at Juilliard, and
Mhm.
which I did. I was there for a year. The whole freshman class met with me as a chorus, about 125 of them. And the next period, the whole sophomore class met, and it was the chorus. And they mostly didn't really like being there. They wanted to practice 10 hours a day. But, but you know, I was there, and it's on my resume. I didn't really enjoy it that much because the kids were like, as I said, they wanted to be practicing. But there was something else I wanted to say, and now I forget. Let me just think. Robert Mann,
Mhm.
the first violinist of the Juilliard Quartet, I believe.
Yes.
So while I was at Juilliard, I went to the convocation, I guess you call it, or the lecture that he and others gave incoming freshmen. And I remember him saying to them, when you're feeling the pressure of life, sing, join a chorus, you know, and it really helps. And another thing, I conducted the senior citizen choir at the 92nd Street Y. I was there like 7 years.
Mhm.
I remember Robert Mann's mother was there, one of the members of the choir. So anyway, I just thought I would tell you these things. But anyway, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I enjoy spending this time. I look forward to more concerts and more. I'm sure you'll let me know whenever you're playing Dad's music. We're
Yes,
all looking forward to the day when we can have a concert in person again.
exactly. And hopefully that'll be in the fall for me, next fall, which is 2021. I'm planning on doing a lot of Bach, 15 concerts of Bach I have already planned.
Wow.
Delaying, until the pandemic is over, and then back to contemporary music. His music your father's music has given me a great deal of joy over the years. So,
well, and he always felt that you and your chorus performed it well.
Well,
and he didn't glad hand.
Right.
So.
Well, I appreciate that very much. All right, Tony, thank you so much.
Sure. Happy to be with you, Harold.
Thank you. Bye-bye.